remember to record it. I'm surprised I actually remember that. So yeah, if that's okay with all of you, we are going to record this because we have a YouTube page for the Conservation District that we like to post our different events on, especially when it's easy in this Zoom space, so that people, if they're unable to make it, can go back and watch. So welcome to our second Cocktails and Conservation. My name is Jillian and I'm the Big Sky Watershed Corps member serving with the GCD. Very happy that a few of you decided to show up. Wanted to give a quick little overview for those who may not be familiar with the Conservation District. We are a form of local government that serves the residents of Gallatin County with different conservation and natural resource initiatives. So we have cost share programs, grants, as well as a lot of youth and education series and events such as this one. And we are very excited for the summer to be kicking off. We actually have a garden planting day, which is on June 1st from 10 a.m. to noon. Sid, if you could throw in the little volunteer Google form into the chat. That's like a general form if anyone ever wants to volunteer, but I think this one's my most favorite because then when you come and visit the garden to pick the produce, it's a little more satisfying that you helped plant it. So today we have Alexis here from Republic Services, and she is going to be talking to us about food waste. I'll kick it over to her and let her share her screen and we can get started.
Awesome. Thanks, Jillian. And I'll just take a minute to make sure I get the screen sharing set up properly. Okay, does that look like a PowerPoint slide to you?
Yes, I can see it. And if anyone has any issues, feel free to throw them in the chat, or if you have questions throughout, you can do that too.
Great. And I will also give a disclaimer. My computer sometimes mutes me. It's a glitch known to this computer. So please interrupt me if it mutes me so that I can fix it. Okay, well, I will start by first saying thanks to Jillian and Sid and the Gallatin Conservation District for having me tonight, and thanks to everyone who's joining from home. So tonight's talk is all about food waste, and this is a topic that really interests me because several years ago, I actually worked on a study with the World Wildlife Fund looking at food waste in school. So I was hired as a consultant, and what we did was go into schools and actually audit the food waste created at lunchtime. The picture you can see on the screen right now is just showing you the typical food waste after one lunch period in your typical elementary school. I was really appalled to see how much food is being wasted. It's a really fascinating topic because it's rampant in our society to waste food, and a lot of people are pretty oblivious to the impacts. So hopefully you all will gain some enlightenment tonight and hopefully do something with that information. Okay, so my goals for tonight's talk are, first of all, to just help you all understand the issue of food waste, both the magnitude of how much food we actually waste, as well as the environmental impacts. Secondly, I want you all to just understand what happens to food that we throw away here in Gallatin County. So we're going to look at two different systems of waste disposal, garbage and then composting. And then finally, I want to just give you all an action plan, some things that you can do in your everyday life to just help reduce your own personal food waste. So to get started, I'll just give some background information about Republic Services and what we do and what I do. Republic Services is an environmental services company, and here in Gallatin County, we provide both garbage and recycling service to pretty much all the towns and communities throughout the entire county. So we operate all the way out to Three Forks to the west and then all the way down to West Yellowstone. And we serve everyone from individuals who want service at their household to businesses, construction, entire industries. We are based out of Bozeman. We do have a facility over on Huffine Lane where we have about 35 trucks and over 40 employees. We have drivers, we have mechanics, we have sales staff, admin, and it's a lot of work to handle garbage and recycling and waste on a daily basis. So next time you see our drivers, give them a wave because they do work really, really hard out there. In my role as the municipal contract administrator, I basically do community outreach and recycling education. So you might see me at local farmers markets, festivals, like Sweet Pea Festival, farm fair, some of those kind of things. And then another thing that I do is I work with our charitable foundation. So as a company, we're deeply committed to sustainability. And one of our core tenets is just being good neighbors. So we donate a lot of free garbage service or recycling service to various organizations. We also do small cash grants and just basically help different organizations that help our communities thrive. So I feel really fortunate to get to be the person who gets to partner with different organizations and really do some very fun and meaningful work giving back to the community. So as a major garbage hauler, Republic Services as a company literally deals with billions of pounds of wasted food per year. And a lot of people don't realize that when we study the waste stream in the United States, food is actually the most common material that we throw away. So food makes up about 22% of the typical household's garbage, followed closely by paper at around 21%. Plastics only make up about 12% of our household waste. And if we look at food plus yard waste or organic material, basically over 1/3 or about 35% of our municipal waste stream is compostable material that we really shouldn't even be throwing in the trash. So when it comes to food waste specifically, I do want to start out helping us explore the issue by having a little fact or fiction game. So quick game, and we'll use the chat for this. What I will do is I'm going to make a statement, and then you have to guess whether it's a fact or whether you think it's fiction. And what you can do is you can just type in the chat, and we'll see what people think. Okay. So here we go. First question, fact or fiction? The average American throws away over a ½ pound of edible food per day. Do you believe it or not? Let's see some responses in the chat. Okay, give people a few more seconds. Fact or fiction, the average person throws away over a ½ pound of edible food per day. Looks like most people got this correct. This is indeed a fact. So a ½ pound of food per day may not sound like that much, might be like a little bit of leftover lunch, couple bites of apple. But when we add this up, even for a single person, that results in over 200 pounds of edible food being thrown out per year. Nationwide, that really adds up to our country throwing away over 80 billion pounds of food per year. And I will point out that this is happening in a time when 1 out of every 8 people in our country is food insecure, which is quite unfortunate that we're wasting so much when there are plenty of people who aren't getting enough. Okay, next question, fact or fiction? The typical family of 4 spends $500 a year on food they waste. Show me in the chat. Do you all believe this? Do you think it's a fact? Or do you think this is fiction? Okay, we're getting a couple votes coming in. Fact or fiction, the typical family of 4 spends $500 a year on food that they just throw out. All right, this one is actually fiction. Shockingly, it's way more than $500 a year. The average family of 4 does waste about $1,800 worth of food every year. This fact alone, when I learned this, was enough to make me really stop and look at my own household food waste. It definitely incentivized me of, whoa, what am I doing? I could do something maybe a little differently and save some money here. That's a lot of money. When we look at this one nationwide, the cost of food waste, the US throws out over $218 billion worth of food every year, which is equivalent to over 1% of our GDP. So it's a pretty substantial economic waste. Okay, nice job with that. Next question, fact or fiction? Leftovers are the most common cause of food waste at home. Do you all believe that or not? Leftovers. are the most common reason we waste food? Okay, this one, it looks like we have pretty split results. This one is fiction. Leftovers definitely are part of the problem, but studies of behavior and what people are throwing out and why show that essentially expired foods or foods that have gone bad are the most common cause. And the issue here, some of the foods are expired. For example, you might see mold on your strawberries, let's say, or carrots that are kind of oozing, something you definitely don't want to eat. But another big part of the issue here with quote unquote expired foods is food labels. So unfortunately, millions and millions of pounds of food get thrown out due to people seeing a label that says use by or sell by or best if used by. We're going to talk about those labels a lot later on. Because basically they're not regulated and they are really misleading, and they do lead to people throwing away an incredible amount of food that there's actually nothing wrong with, food that is perfectly good and that people could be eating. Okay, next question with the fact or fiction. Throwing away edible food contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. Do you all believe that or not? Throwing away edible food contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. All right, it looks like everyone has got this one. Like, yes, this absolutely is a fact. And to help us understand this, we need to just realize that any food item we eat doesn't just magically appear at our home. It goes through an entire product life cycle, and there are greenhouse gas emissions at every step of the way. So with food production, just the act of converting natural habitat, whether it's forest habitat or grasslands, into agricultural lands, that land use change definitely has greenhouse gas emissions there. The greenhouse gas emissions that come from livestock, whether it's raising cattle, raising goats, sheep, etc. We also get greenhouse gas emissions from using and applying pesticides, fertilizers to help our crops grow. And then obviously there are greenhouse gas emissions that come from manufacturing food that has to be processed and then shipping food, because we all know that our food, we get food from all over the globe for many of us. And so when it comes to the climate change impacts of our food waste makes up 11% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And essentially, if food waste were a country, it would be the world's third leading source of greenhouse gas emissions after China and the United States. So not only is food waste affecting climate change through greenhouse gas emissions, there are other impacts as well. So besides greenhouse gas emissions, wasting food is also wasting the water that it takes to produce that food, the energy that it takes to produce that food. And we can also think of the amount of fertilizer it took, and then finally just the sheer amount of agricultural land that is used or wasted to produce food that's just going into the garbage. So that's going to have impacts on even bigger issues like biodiversity. So yeah, it's a no-brainer that unfortunately food production does have environmental impacts, and it's tragic when we take food that we produced and just throw it in a garbage can, and all those environmental impacts were for nothing. Okay, nice job with the fact or fiction, everyone. Thanks for playing along, and I'm glad it worked on the chat. Now that we have an idea of how big of a problem food waste is, what some of the environmental impacts are, we're now going to explore what actually happens to food that we waste locally here in Gallatin County. So most food that people don't eat does end up in the trash. And here in Gallatin County, like most places in the US, we do use landfills to dispose of our trash. So regardless of who's collecting your trash or if you're self-hauling it, it's all ultimately going to the same place, which is Logan Landfill out in Logan. And to give you an idea of how much trash we create, last year, every day, the landfill received an average of over 1 million pounds of garbage. And if we extract the nationwide statistic that just over 20% of this garbage is food, that means that Gallatin County residents are sending about 200,000 pounds of edible food to Logan landfill every single day. Once our garbage gets out to Logan landfill, it does get buried underground. And I think the important thing some people don't realize is we don't just put the trash in the ground. A landfill is actually a highly engineered system where it's an underground storage container. So we do have multiple layers of lining to the landfill using both clay and plastic artificial liners, because essentially we don't want anything that we're putting in the landfill to leak out. So if you can imagine, we're creating this underground storage container. We put the waste inside. When a cell of the landfill fills up and we don't have any more space, we do cap it. So we put imagine like a plastic lid on top, and then we plant grass and allow plants to grow on top. And then our garbage that is buried inside that landfill just sits there for a really, really long time. So even if you are throwing away food, we all know that food is biodegradable. If I threw old moldy carrots outside, they would disappear very quickly because in the ecosystem, they would get eaten by something. Either an animal would eat them, or decomposers like worms and bugs and bacteria would, in about 6 to 8 weeks, completely decompose those carrots and nothing visible would be left behind. So the carrots you see in this picture were dug up out of an old landfill. They had been buried for over 30 years. So you can see that after 30 years, the carrots had started to decompose a little bit inside that landfill, but they hadn't decomposed the way they should and gone away. And the reason why is that a landfill isn't designed to promote decomposition. And basically the limiting factor is oxygen. In the landfill, the garbage is tightly packed because we want to be really efficient with our usage of space. That does mean there's no oxygen, there's no sunlight underground. And essentially what happens is we need oxygen to support the different organisms that help things decompose and break down. So we get extremely limited decomposition. So with the organic materials we put in the landfill, the decomposition that does occur is an anaerobic process. And what that means is that that decomposition creates methane gas as a byproduct. So any of you who've ever smelled your garbage, let's say, where you're like, oh, the trash is starting to stink, it's time to take it out. What you are smelling is a result of organic materials starting to decay and generate methane gas. So methane gas that's coming from food waste in landfills creates issues. And I would say the biggest one, besides the odor, is that methane is a greenhouse gas that does contribute to climate change. So when we look at human sources of methane gas, landfills are actually the third leading source of methane worldwide. And essentially, Republic Services does its best to capture landfill at or to capture methane at our bigger landfills, because we can burn it, we can use it as natural gas, we can use it to generate electricity. But at small landfills like Logan, unfortunately, that methane just gets vented into the atmosphere. At some point, as our population grows, we probably will start flaring the gas here locally. But essentially, we're creating a major greenhouse gas pollutant that's coming from the decomposition of organic waste. So it is creating air pollution issues for sure. Okay, so that's kind of landfills in a nutshell, and hopefully the take home for all of you is that it's really not ideal to be sending organic material to the landfill. So let's look at what would be a better disposal solution for food scraps and any organic material like yard waste as well, and that would be composting. So some of you may have composting systems at home. You may have your own compost pile. And we are really fortunate here in Gallatin County in that if you don't want to deal with a compost pile, we do have two small private companies that do compost collection. We have Yes Compost and Happy Trash Can. Both of them offer service for residents. Some of it is curbside depending on where you live. And then regardless of where you live, both companies offer drop-off points so that you can take your compost and drop it off if you live further out away from Bozeman to make the service accessible to pretty much everyone. So with composting, the things we can compost are basically anything that is a plant or animal material. So for the commercial composters, they will take pretty much any and all food. That includes meat, dairy, you name it. If it's a plant or animal product, they will take it. In addition to food, we can compost any paper products used in food service that are uncoated by plastic or wax. So some examples there would be napkins and paper towels, rough paper plates that don't have a shiny plastic coating, cardboard, especially food soiled cardboard, like a greasy pizza box. We actually can't recycle it because it's greasy and dirty, but we could compost it. And then things like coffee filters, tea bags, etc. And then finally, a growing portion of the commercial compost stream is commercially compostable plastics. So there's definitely a growing market for plant-based plastics that are made from usually corn. And the way you will know if you have a plant-based compostable plastic is it will say compostable or it will say compostable in a commercial facility. So the thing to realize is that traditional plastic is made of oil and it cannot be composted because living organisms cannot eat and digest oil. But these new bioplastics or plant-based plastics, if they are indeed made from plants, they absolutely can be composted and both of the local companies will accept them. So essentially what you do with composting is you collect all your materials. I just use a plastic bin with a lid on it. And then I use Yes Compost. So they give me a 5-gallon bucket like you can see in the picture here. And then they collect it every other week and bring it to their facility. And regardless of who you're using, if you're doing commercial composting, what each company does is they bring all the food waste back to their location. They essentially pile it up. They put a tarp over it that kind of helps maintain temperature as well as moisture levels. And they essentially let the food waste sit for a period of about 8 weeks, and they let the microbes just do their work. So over a period of 8 weeks, the microbes will eat the compostable material. Kind of the difference between Yes Compost and Happy Trash Can is Happy Trash Can does a standard composting process using just bacteria. Yes Compost, they actually use worms. So after some initial breakdown of the material, they finish it by feeding it to worms, which creates an exceptionally valuable end product of vermicompost or worm castings, which is essentially worm poop. But regardless of which process you're using, the end result is finished compost, which you can see in the lower right picture, which is essentially an extremely useful product for anyone who is growing. Benefits of composting, first and foremost, are that composting diverts a significant amount of waste from the landfill. If we were to compost all of our food waste and yard waste, that would take 35% of our trash away from the landfill. That would help our landfill last much longer. I moved here from the Seattle area where their landfill is out of space come 2030, and they are looking at really, really expensive solutions because it's really expensive to create new opportunities. And the same thing will happen here in Bozeman. Land is already really expensive. When our landfill is full, we are going to be in the same position Seattle is, of they're now looking at having to put their garbage on trains and send it over 500 miles. So yeah, even though we have plenty of life left in our landfill, we should be thinking ahead to how do we maximize the life? Because when it's full, it's going to be really expensive and difficult to find other alternatives. So we really don't want to be filling it up with stuff that shouldn't belong there. Another benefit of composting, besides saving space in the landfill, saving methane emissions from the landfill, is that composting is essentially nature's way of recycling, where we're taking this old product, let's say your banana peels, that you don't want anymore, and instead of throwing it to waste to just sit in the landfill, we are actually recycling it. We're breaking it down and turning it into a new and useful product, which is finished compost. And then using finished compost in gardens or on farms has a tremendous amount of benefits, from providing nutrients to help promote better plant growth, helping the soil retain its moisture, preventing harmful microbes or fungi from cropping up in the soil, preventing soil erosion. So anyone who's used compost for agricultural uses definitely knows that there are tremendous benefits of using it to help grow new plants. So I hope you all are now realizing, okay, composting, that's awesome. What a great thing to do with our food, to recycle it into something new. But I think a lot of people just instantly think, oh, composting, eco-friendly. And they don't realize that composting your wasted food is actually not ideal. And what I'm getting at here is way, way better than, you know, taking your leftover dinner and throwing it in the compost bin, is to just eat the leftover food and not waste food in the first place. So a really good illustration is the food recovery hierarchy that you're looking here. Essentially, this pyramid shape and the coloring is showing us that our least preferred options are the smaller things at the bottom in red, and our best options for resource conservation are the things at the top in green. So if I have leftover food, pretty much the worst thing I could do with it is send it to Logan landfill to generate methane gas and cause issues. Slightly better would be composting it. But the reason that composting isn't that ideal is, again, the tremendous environmental impacts of producing that food in the first place. Because when I compost, let's say a half of a hamburger, I'm still wasting a bunch of water and oil and land that it took to create that food that could have been eaten. So a better option than composting would be feeding leftover or unwanted food to animals. So I actually worked with a school that collected apples from the lunchroom and gave it to a farmer that had horses nearby. That was a really cool, creative solution. Anyone that has chickens, pigs, you know, even your household dog or cat, if it's certain foods that they can have, animals need to eat. The food needs to come from somewhere. So feeding animals is a better solution than composting. Better than that is feeding the food to people. And then finally, our optimal solution is just not wasting food that could be eaten in the first place. So what I want to end with tonight is just giving you all some ideas on how you can reduce food waste in your own life. So one great place to start with waste reduction is to start understanding what those labels that I was talking about earlier actually mean. I'm sure you've all seen that when we look at food, whether it's meats or dairy products, or even boxed foods in our pantry, a lot of them do have these different use by, sell by, best if used by, etc. And the most important thing for you to realize is that those terms, with the exception of infant formula, for every other type of food, those terms are not regulated. They are mere suggestions, and they tend to focus more on the quality or the taste of the food, of it's going to taste the best if used by this date. They don't mean that you're going to get sick or the food is going to spoil if it's not used by a certain date. So I would suggest for everyone to just take a little time to do some research online. You can read more about specific terms and what they mean. There is some talk out there of just trying to get some consensus on different terms and changing the terminology that's used. But really, I would say it's up to us as consumers to learn to use our senses to identify if food is safe to eat or not. And it is pretty obvious. So you should be visually looking at food and looking for, okay, is it getting moldy or slimy or starting to rot? You can smell it. And you can taste it. And I can tell you from personal experience that I have eaten plenty of food that's past the best by or sell by date. And knock on wood, I've never gotten sick, but I always rely on my senses to decide if something is indeed still good to eat. And then another really good resource is, I think it's the USDA has an app called Food Keeper, and it's a great resource for giving you suggestions on how to properly store food, how long you can expect certain types of foods to last before actually spoiling, and just giving you suggestions on how to prepare foods for freezing them, and really just helping you understand actions you can take to get the most out of your food and preserve the longevity of food as much as possible. Okay, another action besides reading more into food labels, oh, sorry, something just went crazy, is becoming a smarter shopper. So this is going to kind of have multi-steps to it. One thing I would say right away is, if you want to cut down on food waste, you definitely should get in the habit of planning a menu. I do my menu planning pretty much weekly. I have a fun little dry erase chart that's on my fridge that shows all the different days of the week, and I write out the week's menu so I can take this big picture look of, okay, what am I making? What ingredients am I going to need? And then once I have my menu decided, I shop my home first. So I shop the fridge, shop the cabinets, see what I have, see what I need. And then I make a grocery list that not only says what I need, but also gives an approximate quantity of how much I need to buy. And then once you're at the store, I think one of the biggest challenges is people tend to get suckered into buying too much. And especially with sales, where it's like, oh, I was going to go buy 1 container of strawberries, but now they're buy one, get one free. So I'm going home with 2. And then we don't eat half of them and they end up getting moldy and I throw them out. So really realizing, especially if you live in a small household, I live in a 2-person household, it is very easy to overbuy certain products. Sour cream is another one where I've finally learned that, yes, it may be cheaper per ounce to buy the bigger container, but every time I buy it, we don't eat it in time, it gets moldy and I throw it out. So I've finally learned to buy the smallest container possible, even though it may not be cheaper per ounce. I'm able to eat it all so it doesn't go to waste. So really just make your shopping list, stick to it, and don't, let Costco bulk foods or buy one, get one sales sucker you into buying way too much. And then some other thoughts on smart shopping, especially if you live in a smaller household. Shopping the bulks can be great because it allows you to buy small quantities of something if you're only going to use it for one dish or recipe. And then another thing to think about is just shopping the sale produce, that, okay, stuff that they're putting on markdown because it's about to reach that, that sell by date or whatever. And also buying ugly produce, something I did today, where I went to buy potatoes and I actually bought the ones that had these funny knobs on them, because there's nothing wrong with ugly produce, but most people won't buy ugly produce. And it's a great way to cut down on waste, to say, oh, there's nothing wrong with that. It's shaped a little funny. It looks a lot of funny, but it's still perfectly edible. Okay, another thing to think about is reusing foods that we have. So obviously saving leftovers is something to think about. Even if it's only a couple bites, my husband makes fun of me all the time for saving like 4 bites of a sandwich, but I will say, 3 hours later when I'm starting to get hungry, I'm glad I saved those 4 bites and it makes a perfect snack and it does get eaten. Some other things with reusing foods are to think about things like, okay, my fruit, let's say my bananas are getting way too soft and mushy, I can turn them into banana bread instead of throwing them out. Or I've got some fruits that are getting a little soft, I can blend them into a smoothie. Or if my veggies are starting to get a little mushy, I could make them into a soup. And with the invention of the internet, whatever you have, whether it's bread that's starting to get kind of stale, you can just Google it and find plenty of great uses to turn it into something different and useful instead of throwing it away. And then also just thinking about sharing with others. I definitely have found myself with too much food where I go to the neighbors and say, hey, I have half a watermelon. There's no way I'm going to eat it. And they've been psyched to take it off my hands and share it with their family, or bringing stuff into work so that my colleagues can eat it. Just really thinking about, okay, we can't eat this. Who nearby could use this food? And always checking with the food bank is something to think about as well, depending on what you have and if it's something they could use. Another key thing in reducing food waste at home is organization and organizing your fridge. So the way I use my fridge is on the outside of it, I have my menu for the week, and I also have my shopping list. So that as I'm cooking in the kitchen, I run out of something, I can just jot it down on the list that's hanging on the fridge. And then on the inside, I'd say the most important thing about organizing your fridge is just to make stuff really, really visible and to keep priority foods that need to get eaten visible and in the front of the fridge. So when you come home with fresh groceries from the grocery store, remembering to put the new things in the back of the fridge and pulling the older stuff to the front. One of the most common causes of waste is stuff that gets continually pushed back, and just forgotten about. Using clear containers and labeling the contents and date is really helpful. And then also putting stuff that needs to get used up at eye level, and maybe even creating a eat me first kind of bin or labeled section of the fridge. I think especially if you have kids in the household, it can be really helpful for them to know, like, hey, this is the shelf or the basket we're prioritizing trying to eat first. Finally, something that seems so simple, but people often forget, is just that if you have too much of something or foods that you're worried are gonna start to turn a bit before you get to use them, just to remember to use your freezer. And once again, that Food Keeper app, for pretty much every type of food, it has great suggestions on how to prepare foods for freezing. By freezing foods instead of putting them in the fridge, it's going to greatly extend the shelf life. So when you have something even in the fridge that you know you're not going to get to in time, just remembering to freeze it, put a label on it, and remembering to shop your freezer first as well can really help cut down on food that we need to throw away. All right, so that is pretty much all I have for you all tonight. Pretty short and sweet. And I figured I will now just turn it over to questions or comments or anything that any of you want to talk about.
I had a question actually when you were talking about the compostable like cups and different flatware that we might get when you're getting like takeout or something like that. So I feel like a lot of times those solutions seem great, where obviously like you could just use reusable things. And so I kind of
Yes.
wanted to hear, obviously, like your chart, like there is like the better option of just using something that's reusable, but like how, like what are your opinions on that compostable like takeout stuff?
Yeah,
Like, is it really
totally.
worth, you know, the energy
Totally.
to use it? Yeah, stuff like that.
That's a great question, Jillian. I'm glad you asked that. I think most people don't realize that disposable stuff is bad. Even if it's compostable, disposable anything, stuff that's designed to be only used one time and then thrown away, whether it's recycled, composted, whatever, on a planet with almost 8 billion people living and consuming every day, that is not a sustainable business model. So I have to say, like, I think compostable stuff is marginally better than disposable plastic. But at the end of the day, creating all that compostable stuff means that we are using land. So that's affecting biodiversity. It's going to be having effects of, you know, nutrient runoff, fertilizer use, et cetera, to grow the compostable stuff. It's going to have significant climate change impacts. It's going to have water usage impacts. It's going to have energy impacts. So really it comes back to our simple reduce, reuse, recycle, where you are exactly right that rather than focusing so much on switching to compostable, we should be focusing on switching to reusable. Of, okay, I have this cup that we're going to wash and we're going to use it for years and years instead of a cup that is only used once and composted. So it's tricky. Again, composting is better than trash, I guess, or marginally, but at the end of the day, I think it's kind of easy to have some greenwashing there. And then I will say, when I worked in Seattle, Seattle has mandatory composting. And the issue that the composters were running into was at some point when you get a critical mass of bioplastics, they actually don't decompose that well. And so I've talked to the guys here at Happy Trash Can and Yes Compost. They are not worried about that yet. They're not getting too much of that stuff. But I do know that it affects essentially the material composition of compost. Anyone who's done a compost pile knows that it needs to be a balance of like nitrogen, carbon, et cetera, in order for the composting process to work. So long-term, I don't think composting is a solution, because once your population hits a certain point, commercial composting gets extremely challenged to have the materials actually break down and compost properly.
I've also noticed too, kind of like piggyback on that, and I think it's correct, but there's times where I think I'm using something plastic, so I rinse it out and then you go to recycle it, but it's actually compostable. And I think that can, I mean, if they're sorting it out, but if those items don't get caught, then maybe it can kind of like mess with the composition of even like recycling plastics.
Yeah, and we do see confusion both ways. The recyclers, we get compostable stuff that shouldn't be in the recycling, and the composters get stuff that's not a bioplastic. So all I can say to everyone is just to look really, really carefully. There are some companies that have labels that might have a green leaf, or it might say eco-friendly. That does not mean compostable. It has to actually say compostable on it for it to be acceptable. So be really careful and scrutinize carefully when you're reading those labels, because there are some that look at first glance like they're compostable and they're actually not.
Alexis, I have a couple of questions for you.
Sure.
One, it's a little side tangent, but as far as recycling, what is the contamination going on as far as recycling here in Gallatin County?
You know, I think that's a great question. Overall, things are pretty good with the exception of plastic. Plastic is where we see the most contamination. And the issue with plastics is the only plastics that Gallatin County can take, regardless of who's taking it, it's all going to the same place. So we can only take number one plastic bottle shape, like soda bottles and water bottles, and then number two plastic jugs, like a milk jug or a laundry detergent. All other plastics, so like strawberry containers are a great example, they are not recyclable. So with plastics, you have to ask yourself, is it a number one bottle shape? Is it a number two bottle or jug? And if the answer is no, or I'm not sure, then you should throw it out. So that Yeah, plastics have been a thorn in our side for a long time. And other than that, I think we're doing really well. And plastics are just the thing that I continually try to hammer on and just educate people as much as possible. So thank you for asking and allowing me an opportunity to educate.
Sure. Yeah, I look at strawberry containers and they say 1 or 2, and so I recycle it. So this is very good to know. Thank you.
Yeah, and the issue there is just that a 1 is not a 1 of like, basically some ones are heat molded, some are cold molded, and it does make a difference. And the ones that actually can be recycled are the bottle shaped. So really it has to have that shape. It's not just the number, it's the shape as well as the number.
Good to know. Thank you. And then
Yep.
the other one is, what are your thoughts on like garbage disposal for those, exceptions of, meats or rogue foods that wouldn't be able to be composted?
Yeah, honestly, your best bet is to just throw it out. So with the garbage disposal, like I'm in the city, so anything I put in my garbage disposal is basically going to end up in the wastewater treatment system. And it is going to have to be picked out of the wastewater treatment system and then sent to Logan. It's easier to just send it directly to Logan. It saves energy.
I think you muted, or I got muted just a little bit.
Sorry about that. So your best option is to just directly put it in the trash, because it's going to end up at Logan anyway, and it's just going to save money, time, and energy by having you put it there instead of having to send it through the entire wastewater treatment system and have it be skimmed out.
Got it. Good to know. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and so I'll say my garbage disposal, I don't use it that much other than just kind of like runoff. But anything I have, I put it in my compost, and if for some reason it couldn't, just put it in the garbage.
Okay. Sounds good. Thank you.
Yep, great question.
The one other question that I was thinking of, and I know a little bit about it, but I was kind of curious if you could do like a little rundown between the difference of like regular composting and vermicomposting, especially for those who like might want to try doing it at home versus giving it to a service.
Yeah. So regular composting is the first step of all composting, even vermicomposting, where you literally are just piling stuff together and letting nature take its course. With the vermicomposting, you are, or essentially at Yes Compost, they are then finishing it by feeding it to their worms. So I've done a worm bin at home. It is something that anyone can do. I would say that the big disadvantage of worms is just that they can't eat that much relative to the amount of food that a household of more than like 2 or 3 people is going to generate. So you'd have to have a pretty big worm bin to deal with like a school lunchroom, for example. I've had schools ask about it, and it's like, no way, it's just not practical for the amount of waste a lunchroom is generating. You'd have to have a pretty big worm operation. I will say worm bins are super easy. You can buy red wiggler worms from Carl at Yes Compost. I've purchased them from him to make worm bins, and basically you just need a plastic container. You can start it off with just some damp newspaper strips, and then basically, throw in some organic material like leaves and grass from a yard, and off you go. Worm bins are pretty easy. But again, maybe not practical if you're generating a fair amount of food waste. The big advantage, and the reason that Carl at Yes Compost does it, is that it does create a higher quality compost product at the end than a standard composting process. And so essentially, even as a composter, like Carl can sell the finished worm castings for a way higher price than like a standard compost that's not using worms to finish it. I guess it's the nutrient value. I'm not sure. I just know that it's a better quality. product to be used for agriculture. So if you are doing your own compost pile at home, honestly, you're probably going to have an easier time just doing a standard composting process. But I would say, especially if you have kids or you're just curious about worms, it can be fun to do a small bin in like a Rubbermaid container just as a experiment. And, you know, maybe if you had 1 or 2 people and you were really conscious about food waste, that could work. It just depends how much waste you're generating.
Thank you. We are getting to the last couple minutes here. Obviously, you can leave time for if other people have questions. But if not, I just wanted to say thank you everyone for coming, and especially thank you to Alexis. That was super interesting. I obviously knew a little bit about this, but I didn't know like just the sheer amount of food that we are wasting, especially when you put it in the context of just Bozeman. So it kind of,
Yeah.
We can see it in like kind of maybe grasp a little bit more versus some of those global numbers. So I personally will be doing what I can to try and reduce that food waste. I find that I should probably go to the grocery store more often and just buy things less, which of course can take time, but a good habit for sure. And as a plug, we have the Manhattan Farmers Market, which is a great way to support local farmers. And also you can buy more specific amounts for what you want. And hopefully that makes the weekly grocery shopping more fun, in my opinion, at least. So I'm going to throw my email in the chat in case anyone has any questions about volunteering or getting involved in the Gallatin Conservation District. And we will be posting this recording online if anyone wants to, brush up on some facts and flex on their friends how much they know about food waste. And yeah, so if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. If not, you all are free to go, and I hope you all have a nice rest of your evening.
Awesome. Thank you everyone for being here. And thanks again to the Gallatin Conservation District for having me. And my contact info is up on the screen, and please feel free to reach out at any time if you have questions, if you know of another group that, wants to have a talk, or any ways that I can help.
Okay, I didn't want to end the meeting if anyone had a question. So I think we're all good at this point. Thank you so much, Alexis, and we'll be in touch, definitely.
Awesome. Thank you. Have a good one.
You too.
See ya.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.